Hello and welcome back to the Out of Program podcast. Today we're joined by Dr. Sayinthen Vivekanantham, a doctor by training who developed an extensive property portfolio before then founding Homey, an online conveyancing platform for property buyers, real estate agents, and solicitors to collaborate. Hi, Say. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Jing.
So let's get started. And I want to start from the beginning. What first drew you to medicine and how did you find your time as a medical student?
Yeah. So for me, when I was 18, so young and so naive, when I was choosing a career, I wanted to choose a career that I could ultimately solve problems in. Because I liked solving issues. I liked creating fixes. I liked coming up with ideas. So as an 18-year-old, or 17-year-old when you're applying, right? Or 16-year-old or whatever, when you start applying, I always thought, okay, wait, what would be, the coolest thing in the world would be diagnosing and solving issues for people, right? Like, people will come in with a problem and you can kind of think of creative solutions and solve that. But I think, as I went through medicine, what became more and more apparent to me is that actually medicine isn't that creative and probably rightly so, because, you shouldn't be creating solutions to test on someone's life, you shouldn't be reinventing surgical procedures, right? In fact, good medics are people that can follow instructions really well and be able to do it, be able to recall knowledge and kind of be able to do it in a sort of cookie cutter approach. So over my time as a medical student, I felt that I hadn't made the right choice as a doctor or wanting to be a doctor. I felt like there was not much room for creativity in the workplace and, especially also in the NHS. Any ideas you had around different ways of doing things were often dismissed. And there was these endless layers of bureaucracy that kind of existed, firstly in medical school and then onwards into the workplace. So I think for me, I needed an avenue for being creative. I needed an avenue to be sort of in some ways rebellious and do things a different way than I was being told. And for me, property and business was that avenue. There's parts of my job as a doctor that I loved. I loved the helping people side. I loved the side that you could really create massive change in people's lives if you did things right. But I felt also very constricted by the side of, no, you can't do this. No, you can't set up this software to help how wards are run. There's endless no's that I kept having. And it was like a workplace that rewarded mediocrity. It was like everyone do what they're told and not try and challenge the norm, which unfortunately isn't me. I like to, if I don't like something, if I don't like how something's being run, I want to change it. And if I can't change it, then I am frustrated by it. So that was, my medical sort of journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, I mean, that's super interesting. I think a lot of people feel this sense of frustration going through medical school and clinical training, but I think you certainly describe it in a very stark manner. I think it's very clear how you felt about your experience. So then can you share a little bit about the things that you explored during that time? Because presumably you needed that creative outlet. And of course, you then developed quite a successful career in property. But during that time as a medical student, let's say, were you exploring different things?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think, earlier on in my career, I certainly did try a lot of things. And I think in hindsight, it was the right thing to do. So, I'd like try different ideas, different businesses, different sort of even extracurricular activities. Like I like to try lots of different things to try and understand what I felt was, where home was for me or where I felt the most affinity towards. But I also do think that, to caveat that, I think at some point you do need to then decide that you need to focus, because ultimately, if you are going to succeed in building something outside of medicine, you have to, and build something in a large way. It's hard enough to make something you're working on successful compared to, when you're trying to also spread all the efforts you're doing outside of medicine, on multiple different things. So eventually I was able to find where my niche was and what I wanted to focus on. But I certainly did try a lot of things. I experimented with different business ideas. I wouldn't be averse to kind of throwing myself into different extracurricular activities, but it was all with the view of trying to understand what is what am I good at? Where is my skill set? And also, and what am I also not so good at, right? Because I'm not good at loads of things. And being a good person in business is identifying what you're not good at and finding great people to help you fill the gaps where you lack. So I definitely tried a lot of different things and then ended up landing on property and now property technology as my sort of area of at least what my career is today.
So before we get on to the illustrious career in property, can you talk a bit about the things that you tried that didn't work and provide a bit of color on that?
Yeah, 100%. So I remember in medicine, I would often have lots of small little ideas as to things that I things that I thought would be either a good commercial idea or a good way of making the medical school experience or the workplace as a doctor a better place. I think one idea that comes to mind was I had an idea for an app called Speedback, and the idea behind Speedback was it was fast feedback. It was particularly relevant in lectures because I think most of the people will resonate, who went to medical school with me, right? That 90% of our lectures were absolutely atrocious. So, and the thing is, the problem is the actual lecturers had no insight. They had no they had no concept that what they were delivering was literally going through one ear and out the other for the vast majority of the audience, right? If not all of them. But they, if you went and spoke to them, they just think that they delivered something that was the best thing since sliced bread. So the idea behind this app, which I actually spent a little bit of my elective actually going to try and code in India, and I found a tech team to try and help me with that, was actually can we create an app where anyone can leave feedback for anyone, and these lecturers would have their phone on them, and then these medical students, while they're going through the lecture, would give them feedback in real time, hopefully anonymized, and actually give them some sort of insight into the fact that what they're saying is completely kind of going is kind of beyond anyone, right? So that was something I tried. Obviously, it didn't take off. What I realized, the learning from that was, I was trying to make it a B2C app where anyone could download this app and anyone else could get feedback. And now the biggest challenge with that is, how do you make sure you have enough people using the app to make it useful on day one? On day one, you don't have much cash, and getting people onto an app costs money, like in terms of awareness and attention. So, but look, I didn't know any of that then. But now I can look at that business model and be like, actually, that didn't actually make sense as a business model. But look, it's a journey. That's just one of many small ideas. There's like lots of things in the workplace around rotas and rosters and challenges in medical school, like how do we make things a little bit more efficient? Why was there so much wasted time? Like notes was being shared, like, all sorts of forms of notes. Like, how do we standardize that? A lot of failures, a lot of attempts tried and not many successes. So yeah, but that all contributes to the learning, which then allows you to then find stuff that you can possibly do.
So then let's talk a little bit about property, because what you've just described so far were some of the pain points and things that you came across during your clinical training, during your medical school days, that you then tried to translate into products or solutions. But then it was ultimately property where you saw the biggest gain and opportunity. So can you walk me through how all that came about? Like, how did you get started?
Yeah, 100%. I'll walk you through my journey. So I would always looked at property as a vehicle that was interesting because, my parents came over as economic migrants from Sri Lanka. And so my family hadn't necessarily been able to afford the basic things that a lot of other families may have been able to afford, growing up. And so property to me was like, property had always gone up in value, and a constant table or dinner time conversation, right, was always that I wish we'd bought property earlier, I wish we'd done something earlier because now it's gone up too much in price. So, when it was the turn of the recession and, property prices were crashing, if something's always gone up and it suddenly falls, that's kind of when you want to get in. But that wasn't the prevailing sentiment at the time. It was like, oh, well, look, it's come down, it's going to go down more. Whereas for me, I thought, well, look, I'm young, I can invest and I can weather the storm. I can wait for it to rise. So, I kind of did what I could to put together a small deposit, buy a small place. And being quite entrepreneurial, I spent my weekends, I spent evenings sometimes, kind of doing up the place because I didn't have a lot of money in the early days to do that. But I was able to turn a small profit on my first property that I'd managed to buy, and I was able to go back to the banks and say, hey, look, I've added value to this asset, unlock this value by lending against the higher value that I've created, and they were able to. And for me, I then used the return that I'd made from that first property to put into another property. And suddenly now you have two properties generating you rent. So it's then easier to generate a deposit for your third and fourth. And so it's just continuing to play that game. So you kind of buy the right assets, get them cash generative, use the cash flow from those cash generative assets to place as deposits for your next cash generative assets, and keep scaling up. And as you get more experience, you can do more and more interesting deals. It's a bit like, the first deals you do, you don't really know too much about what you're doing. But once you understand the game, the actual real value and the real profits lie in the more complicated deals. For example, things where you need to get planning permission, things where you have to demolish it and start again, things which are distressed, like people need to transact within days. How do you leverage capital? So ultimately, it's about how do you leverage start slowly, because it's obviously a dangerous game because you're committing your capital and it's levered. And people think mortgages are great, but mortgages are actually they're essentially you're risking your own capital when you're taking a mortgage on the hope that the asset's going to cash flow and be able to repay the capital. So obviously starting small is often good, but once you learn the game, the real money is made when you do the complex stuff later, which other people can't do or don't know how to do, because that's where the really big returns come. So that's how my journey sort of happened. So I kind of started small and learned the trade, and then over the course of 10 years, kind of kept on doing more weird and wonderful deals. And 2020, I built a portfolio of around 25 properties, many of which I still own, and that's how I got into property.
So you started off small, you did a successful deal, and then you started leveling up over time. I mean, with respect, you make it sound really easy. And, the concept that you describe is well known, but very few people execute it as well as you've described. What I think a lot of the audience would be interested in is, how do you get that confidence or that knowledge to make that leap? Because we're talking about big sums of money, and when we're talking about leverage, that holds an incredible amount of risk for many, especially for people who are going through medical school or clinical training, where we are taught to shy away from risk. So talk me through how you got to that point where you were executing at that level.
Yeah. Okay. Great question. I think for me, what it comes down to and what gave me the confidence in the early years was ultimately numbers. So it's what is the cash that you're putting into a deal? What is the return that's expected as rental income? And what is that rental income as a percentage of the cash you're putting in? That's your cost, right? So, and if the percentage is high enough that it justifies deploying your cash into that deal versus leaving your cash in a stocks and shares ISA or leaving it in a fixed interest rate account, then that makes sense, right? It's like saying, hey, I'm going to rent the property out. I know it's fairly easy to rent out, and my cash on cash return is higher than if I were to leave my money in a whatever vehicle it's currently in. Then it makes sense to do the trade. So I think I gained confidence through doing the numbers. I had these weird and wonderful spreadsheets where I'd kind of stress test different scenarios, and I felt like even in a downside scenario, I'd still be okay. I'd still be making a premium on what I'm currently making with my money sat in a bank. And it also then made sense to say, okay, look, let's say you're making 25% cash on cash return. It then makes sense to borrow money at like 5-6%, right? To do that deal, because you're making 25-6. So it's all about looking at the numbers and stress testing things. And also having some guts as well, right? Because look, it is scary. It is committing capital, and it's also a little bit different to what we're taught, throughout, our medical school and our sort of professional lives. We're not taught to take risks. But ultimately, if you ultimately you have one life. You have one life, and that doesn't mean you have to be super zealous and take every single risk that there is out there. But if you're not willing to take calculated risks, then you could look back at one stage and say, okay, look, I wish I didn't that, and I didn't have the courage to do it at that stage. So it's a balance between being reckless and being and being sort of reasonable and calculative in terms of what is a reasonable risk to take. So yeah, I'd say, ultimately people will fall on fall somewhere along that spectrum. But I'd encourage people to say, to look at, what is the genuine downside, and can you afford to take this risk? And how can you get more comfortable with taking this risk? Is there something you need to do or read or reach out to, someone you need to reach out to? And I'm happy for people to reach out to me, happy to give advice and help as freely as they need. But yeah, it's kind of like, I'd encourage people to try and do something if they want to really do it.
And during this journey into property, did any deals go wrong?
Yeah, I'd say so. Collectively, I've probably transacted on around 50 to 60 properties now, right? And there's one property which I remember, it turned out to be okay. But what happened was it was a distressed sales scenario. So essentially, this was actually a block of, I think, 8 properties at the time. I think I'd actually ended up building a few more on it, but basically a developer had actually, he'd gone bust, and the lenders had basically taken over the property, and the lenders were desperate to sell the property as quickly as possible. They needed their cash back for various reasons. They were sort of selling this property hugely undervalued. So this property was valued at 2.4 million, and they were actually selling it at 1.65 million because they needed to get rid of it really fast. So what I'd done was I had gone in, and I didn't have the entirety of what was needed to buy it. And obviously you can't go for a traditional mortgage because it would take too long before it kind of got approved. So I put my cash in to exchange on the property. So I'd given a commitment. I think I'd had to put a 10% deposit down to say, hey, look, I'm committing to buy this. And I had 30 days to then complete the deal. I didn't complete the deal in 30 days, then I would potentially risk the money I'd put down as my deposit. So I did this, and then I went to a bridging lender, which is these lenders that lend on quite expensive terms. But what they do is they can do things quickly, much more quickly than, the traditional banks. Before I'd put the money down, I'd actually had terms from a bridging lender to say that they were willing to lend to me within 30, but it came to 30 days. And although they'd given me the terms and we'd done legals, their funding line, who had to release the money to them, actually didn't release the money because slow processes, issues, slow things. So essentially, I was in a position where I could lose my deposit. So in that scenario, what I ended up doing was just going directly to their offices, right, and then saying, okay, what's happening? They mapped out the whole scenario, and then we, had to continue to apply a little bit of pressure daily. But it was about a week late, but I managed to get the deal done. But it was very possible that if it had gone for another week, I may well have lost my deposit. So,
And I guess that would be tens of thousands of pounds.
Yeah, it'd be about 10% of 1.65 million. So still quite a lot more.
Wow. God, you really buried the lead on that story. Jeez, that's a lot.
So that could have been a very different story that I could have been telling you guys now. But we got the deal done, and that ended up being a great trade because I bought something for 1.65 when it's valued at 2.4, and then I've now actually built a few more flats on it. So now it's even more valuable. But it's kind of, that's the sort of deal where you can make good returns, but also there's an element of risk to it, as you could see.
Yeah, evidently. So then you built out this property portfolio, and then you go on to found Homey. Do you want to tell us a bit about what Homey is and how that originated?
So it got to about 2021, and I built out this portfolio. I was very stable in my sort of career, but my challenges were that there's definitely things that really frustrated me about home buying, just like there was hundreds of things that frustrated me about medicine. And so I got to a point where I thought, okay, so now I'm now just about to embark on the next phase of my life. What do I want to spend my time doing? Do I want to be a doctor? Do I want to be in property? Or do I want to do, something related to health tech? Or do I want to do something related to property tech? And I looked at all of those four options. For me, there was incredible frustration around medicine and the way that you weren't able to kind of build things, create things inside the structures that exist within the NHS. So there was definitely frustration there. And then even in my property career, I felt there's always not every business is super scalable, and property isn't a very scalable business because in property, 1+1 usually equals, let's say, 2 or 3, right? Like if you can create some value. Whereas if you can build a trading business, which is, typically a business where you're offering services to multiple customers, you can go from, 1+1 equals 5 to 10, right? To 20, because it's not a sum. It's not directly proportional to the capital you're investing in. It's more proportional to the value you can create for a customer, which can be, for all means, sometimes infinite, right? So it's how do you, I was really interested in sort of technology as a means to kind of creating a scalable sort of trading business. So then I had to look at, I spent 2021 sort of thinking, do I want to um, do property technology or do I want to do medical technology? Because I had ideas in both. But for me, I was like, I looked at medical technology and what I looked at again was a very regulated environment. Again, in the UK, there's the NHS, which controls a lot of the decisions. A lot of the decisions are very distributed and very difficult to get through to the right people. So that again seemed like a world which was quite to build something scalable in. Also, there's a lot of doctors in medical technology, and doctors invariably, because of the selection process for getting into medical school, are generally on the smarter end of the spectrum. So, and in business, you want to be, you're ultimately competing. You're competing with other people providing solutions. And are your solutions better than the rest of the market, or is your route to market or your approach? So for me, property actually looked quite attractive. It was like, okay, cool. Like I can have some potential competitive advantage kind of going into this sector. And hopefully it's just doctors watching this, not property professionals, but so that's another matter. Basically, kind of gravitated towards property solutions and problems as a whole. Choosing what to do within this area, I actually first started up by deciding that I wanted to do something in this space. And I spent the first 6 months actually just deciding what wall I'm going to climb, because I knew it was going to be a 10, maybe 15, 20 year commitment. I wanted to make sure I was building and moving being in the direction of something which I actually believed could work and could work at scale. So with my own capital and my own money, I hired my first few staff members. A couple of them were interns, and I remember one of them being from Cambridge, and he was super smart. So I was leveraging his smartness because if I'm honest, he was probably smarter than me. he so with him, we kind of bounced off each other and we looked at how did different business ideas and different business models play out, and why would this business model be successful versus others. And so where we ended up at was, first of all, looking at the problem. And the problem that we decided to focus on was, when you're buying a home, you have multiple different people you have to work with, and all of these people use different software systems. So that was a problem, because you as a home buyer then have to be in a few different systems to get a purchase done. And no one says that they have an easy time when they're buying a home. So there is a problem there that needs a solution, right? And currently the world is not servicing that subset of customers well, because everyone is complaining. So that was okay, cool. There is a problem here, right? And so we thought of lots of different ways of solving that. And even today, in today's market, there's lots of different competitors sort of taking different approaches. But my approach was, let's rebuild the software systems that these different professionals use so that we can create a single place where people can go from start to finish, which is not what a lot of the rest of the market is doing. A lot of the rest of the market are either kind of trying to replace one of these professionals or try and provide some layer tools on top of the software that they use. But my hunch and what I'm aiming to do is actually rebuild from scratch, build something that works really well end to end, and kind of replace the vast majority of the architecture that's already exists in that sector. So, the things that we looked at was as to why we thought this was good. With me and that the Cambridge intern, me and Dennis, right? When we looked at it, it was like, okay, well, look, once we build this architecture end to end, it makes a very defensible business because now you've got lots of nodes on a network all connected together. So it's very hard for someone else to come in and recreate a different network. So that was a plus. So to say, okay, look, this can be a really good business at scale. The other thing that we also looked at was, okay, what was the reason why this hadn't already been done? And if you looked at a lot of the software suppliers, these software suppliers were suppliers that were built in the 1990s that currently exist in the space. And cloud computing and cloud-based workflows was not a thing in the 90s. So something had intrinsically changed in the world, like, in the sort of broadband and AOL times, in sort of 2020s, it's sort of created this opportunity to now streamline workflows across multiple different professionals. So again, that made it super exciting to say, hey, look, this is the reason why the world doesn't have this. And now the world has something which is now makes this possible. So that gave some validity to it. And so after sort of 6 months of batting lots of ideas around, I said, this is the one that I'm going to focus on. And off we went. So hired a few more people and set up shop in White City was our sort of first office space. And off we went and started to sort of put together a team and start growing Homey.
Wow. I mean, that's an incredible deep dive into your thinking about the domain, the problem space, and the market opportunity, which I'm sure a lot of people will find incredibly helpful to understand the thinking behind that. I mean, you mentioned that you got started in White City and you built a team and you started, you got the ball rolling. How was that from a startup perspective? Because I suppose, it all makes sense in terms of how you identify that opportunity, but it's one thing to kind of identify it and then actually build a viable business. And the one thing I know about Homey is that you bootstrap this, which I think is quite unique because a lot of people would actually go out and raise capital. So can you talk me through the actual building of the business and how you thought about commercial models, income generation, and fundraising?
Yeah, so for me, it was challenging in the early days because I decided that, my focus wasn't going to be capital raising. So a lot of people will go out there to focus on getting a venture capital round or like an early round. Whereas for me, I'm not so good. If I'm honest, I'm not very good sort of talker. Ultimately, venture and early stage fundraising is speaking a good game to try and get people to believe in you. My strengths was I'm more of a in the trenches, gets my hands dirty kind of guy, start building, start doing stuff. I was fortunate that I had, my previous property business, which gave me some comfort in that I could take risks around hiring people without necessarily having to go out and find and need venture capital to make those early hires. So that basically meant that, with that plus my personality of being in the trenches, getting my hands dirty kind of guy, I just started to look for opportunities, build and want to build something small scale, and then think about how I was going to then start to raise. So yeah, how it sort of evolved was, ultimately in startup game is getting first revenue is super key. And a lot of people really struggle with that, like actually build something that people are willing to pay for. So the way that we approached it was we went and spoke to all of as many professionals as we could in the space to deeply understand where a pain point exists and focus on the smallest pain point that you can find and build something to solve for that very niche pain point. So don't try and build the entire ecosystem end to end, or don't even think about what is best to start building first in the ecosystem. It's actually the approach that we took was what is the smallest issue that we can find that someone needs a solution for, that we can build something for? So that was a pretty, it ended up being quite a large estate agency in London. They ended up needing this very niche solution around making referrals from their estate agency business to some of their law firms. And so we built a product for that very niche vertical. And then from there, we were able to add many more lines or many more features to allow them to do more and more. And of course, we made lots of mistakes along the way. So we'd maybe chosen wrong staff members to delivering products that weren't fully tested, because we were a startup. Every time one of those mistakes were made, we actively sought to how we can prevent that and how we can fix that. And so now we work with about 250 different agents, about 100 different law firms. At any one point, we're probably handling anywhere between sort of 3,000 to 5,000 transactions through our platform every month. Yeah, it's now got to a really good scale, but definitely at the early stages, it was very challenging to do those, to get that early bit of revenue and build the right product early on. But focus and nicheness and pure grit and determination is what helps you sort of overcome that initial barrier.
So where was clinical training in all of this? Because you were, we talked about you graduating and becoming a doctor. You had this property portfolio, and then you started a tech business in real estate. So then, where was clinical?
Yeah, so I did clinical medicine alongside building my property business. So that was if I'm honest, that was a very challenging part of my life or period of my life, because I was balancing my clinical work, and then in the sort of evenings and weekends, I was doing the property side, and it wasn't very healthy. And I don't know if I'd necessarily recommend the scale at which my property business got to whilst doing both clinical medicine and that. So that was sort of that part of the journey. Now, once I'd started to build my technology business, I'd already made a decision to leave medicine. That was, I wasn't having to build my technology business at the same time as doing medicine. I think that would have been very challenging. But one thing I would say is that whilst I was a doctor and I was doing the property business, I did have lots of small ideas. I was never able to actually really get any of them to have any sort of degree of good traction, right? Maybe they might have a few customers here and there, but nothing that really scaled. And I think that was probably because I didn't have the time to focus on it. And in the early days, you will often, the amount of work you put into it, you will not be seeing the rewards. So you'll be, let's say, didn't have medicine and you were just spending 100% of your time on this one idea for a year or two, you may have very little income from it. And you might be thinking, what am I doing with my life? Right. So I had a good clinical job. I had made lots of money from it, and I could have done lots of good in the hospital. And I'm working on this, I was going to say shitty app. I don't know if shitty's allowed on this podcast, right? And it's literally got 0 customers and it's not doing anything. And yes, it might be getting more features, but so if I'm honest, that's like a really nervous place to be. And you're like, it's not a nice place to be. And I certainly felt that at the beginning of Homey. Like once I'd left medicine, I was working, I wasn't drawing a salary. I was working on this idea. We didn't have many customers and it was very hard. I was learning a new domain. And there's many days, I think probably every day, I was thinking, actually, is this the right thing to do? Am I going to look back on this and think, a waste of my time? But it is almost a necessary stage. It's a necessary stage for you to go through to know, to be able to get through to building then something that is growing. I wouldn't say that everyone has to do this. It's not like you have to go through this phase. If you go through this phase, you'll definitely come out on top, because you could easily work on this for a year or two, and it could be the wrong wall you're climbing. And 95% of startups fail. Does that mean you shouldn't do it? No, because there's still a small chance that something could happen and it could work. So you have to just get comfortable with the fact that sometimes you have to go down a road before you actually know whether it's the right road. And there is an element of risk with that. But when you look back at your life, you want to say, you tried it. You tried every opportunity. This was something you wanted to do. You tried it. And if it didn't work out, that's life. But you don't want to have not tried it and then have lots of regrets about not having tried it and then not really know what the outcome was. So it's a bit like, if the girl that you fancied, early when you're quite young, if you never asked her out, right, you will regret that. Not the fact that you asked her out and she said no.
But on the subject of regret, I mean,
Yeah.
what's interesting speaking to you is that when we started this conversation, I think you made your feelings very clear about how you felt about medicine and clinical training and the frustrations. But then what I'm hearing now is almost a tinge of regret, if it's fair to say, because it sounds like you found the best opportunity for you, which was real estate. That was where you were gaining the most traction, the biggest market opportunity. But you talk about all these little projects that you did as a medical student and as a doctor that didn't transpire. So am I right to say that a part of you maybe misses being a doctor, wants to do things in health tech? Because you've made a very clear choice in your career now. You are a real estate entrepreneur. So how do you think about that these days?
So if I look back at my medical career, obviously it wasn't clear at the time, right, that my career would unfold in this way. But if I look back now, I would look at medicine and say it was a mistake for me to have done medicine. And there wasn't, it was a mistake in that I can say that retrospectively. I can't, prospectively, when I'm 16, 17 years old, I would never have known that this would be my life. So it wasn't a mistake at that time. If I could redesign my life now, I would say that I probably wouldn't have done that. The reason why I say that was because, medicine's a 6-year course. So if I'd done something that was 3 years, right, I would have been out a lot earlier and I would have had more capital to then fuel the cycle more. So rather than owning, let's say, 30 properties today, I might now own 50 to 60 properties. I might have started my property technology journey a lot earlier. So that's what I would say sort of medicine is a regret. The other thing as well is that in the game of investments, the earlier you start, the bigger the compounding effect is as time goes on, as long as you're allocating your capital effectively each year. So I started my journey later because I was in a longer course and I had less access to capital. So if I'd done a shorter course and I'd started earlier, then the compounding effect may have been much bigger. And so from a sort of monetary point of view, I would have potentially had a larger net worth right now. But that life's not all about money, right? And so I have made an incredible set of friends, through medicine, right? And I've also learned there's so many things during the day that if you weren't medically trained, like you don't have like a framework to attach what you're feeling or what you're seeing in terms of like physical day-to-day stuff. Like you have a cough, how do you know that it's not a knock? Some people might think I've got a cough, it could be anything, right? But whereas if you're a doctor, it's likely just to be a cough, right? It's not likely to be something sinister. So there is certainly from a career and monetary point of view, one way of thinking of medicine. But then if I also think about it from a personal development and like a personal, what I've got out of it personally, there's also, a huge value add from it. Pros and cons. So regrets wise, I'd say if you look at it purely from a career point of view, yes, it is a regret. But if you look at it from a holistic point of view, probably not a regret. But definitely being in the NHS and having many years sucked out of you where you can't innovate is like torture at another level. But anyway, that's another matter.
Well, I'm sure, we could talk about that for a long, long time. But we are running out of time now, actually. So I've got a last few questions. So for clinicians who are thinking about pursuing different things, stepping away from the traditional path, what practical advice would you share with them?
I would say, what do you want to do with your life? Take away sort of the risk and the finances and the sunk cost fallacy of having done something and think, what do you actually want to do with your life? And what do you want to do day to day? And do you want to try something? And if the answer to that is yes, I want to try something else and you want to do something, make sure you bloody well do it. Because ultimately in life, nothing matters because we are all going to be gone in, let's say, if you're lucky, we'll get to 80. So you don't have that many years here on this planet and everything you own is pretty much rented, right? You're not going to take any of it away, right? So the most important thing is in this moment in time right now, are you doing what you want to do? And you don't know whether you're going to get another moment. You could drop dead this next second, right? I could have a heart attack now and I could be gone, right? It'd probably do wonders for this podcast. But anyway,
Yeah,
the
that'd
thing
be
is,
some fun,
the thing is, it would be, you can't, there's no point planning. There's no point thinking, look, I need to make money. I need to do this. I need to do that. It's too much risk. What will my parents say? What will this person say? No one gives a flying, you can insert the next word, right? That you want. But the thing is, if you want to do something, just do it, because you're not going to get that time again. You're not going to get the opportunity again, and you're just going to regret it. And your life is so short and so temporary on this world that the biggest mistake is to not do what you want to do. Right.
Wow.
So yeah, that's what I'd say.
That's a real battle cry. And then finally, what's next for you?
For me, I'm in the battle of building Homey now. So, we're a growing company. We have a growing revenue base every single month. I have about 50 people working for me. So I have I feel a sense of responsibility to them, and, to try and build the company to kind of sustain growth and sustain their careers. So for me, it's about finishing what I've started. I've started to revolutionize how property is bought and sold. We made a brilliant start. We're probably in our space. We're the company that's growing, we're doing our particular model that's growing the fastest. So continue to maintain that growth and fulfill that vision of creating a single place where people can buy, sell, and own their home. So that's me professionally. From a personal perspective, for me, I do what I do not to I don't see this as my life. I'd want to make sure that I maintain time for my personal life as well. And I'm lucky that I have that the business is now at a stage where I can delegate responsibility. So it's about always building structures and ways in which others in the team can handle the day-to-day growth of the company. And I'm there between 9 to 5, but of course, if they need me, on an odd occasion outside of that time to work on something, to be there to sort of support. But very much try and keep, often people can go down the startup journey or building a business journey, and that becomes their whole life. They work at it 24/7, a bit like Elon Musk, right? But that's not what I aspire to be. I aspire to have a really good work-life balance and build a business that's compatible with that, so that you can still have a growing business, but also have a personal life at the same time.
Brilliant. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining me, Say. And for those listening, if you like what you hear and want to support the show, please do like and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever podcast platform you're currently listening to us on. It would mean a lot to me, and it would help us spread the message to others exploring alternative careers. Thanks for joining us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.